Hello folks, as the title suggests, in this video I remove and service an aftercooler from a Yanmar 4LV 250Z. It's an inline 4-cylinder common rail turbo diesel coupled to a ZT 370 outdrive. The cooler is located behind this cover, and to remove it we start by removing the top cover and its brackets, the engine ECU cover and the engine ECU, the engine ECU bracket, and then the front cover, belt, and seawater pump in order to gain access to these oil lines and the bottom bracket. The cooler core can then be slid out of its housing, cleaned, pressure tested, and reinstalled with new O-rings and plenty of Alco Metalube grease. So let's get started. So right off the bat you can see the cooler is in a pretty tight spot. I've been in marine tech for about 25 years and I've seen so many different configurations, and this one is not all that bad, but I always go after the component or the side that's more difficult to access. It feels a bit of a vacation when you get to the other side. What's nice about having multiple engines though, like in this case, I couldn't really see the fasteners on the bottom side of the cooler. So you can reference the opposite engine, the starboard engine in this case. I can see how many fasteners and what size sockets or wrenches I'm going to be using, and then it makes it a little bit easier when you can't see what you're doing. Okay, now I'm removing the seawater pump to gain access to the bottom of the aftercooler housing, where there are some oil lines and a bottom bracket that holds the cooler onto the engine block. There's a couple of hose clamps and then 4 10mm by 22mm bolts. If you are watching this and thinking about tackling this project yourself, definitely get yourself some Ziploc bags and label them with each fastener, because there's about 33 and you don't want to mix anything up. Okay, moving on to the engine ECU, starting with the cover, the plastic cover over the engine ECU. Okay, as I said earlier in the video, this is an electronic engine, which means the injectors are controlled via the engine computer, similarly to a gasoline electronic fuel injection system. But this is not fly-by-wire system. And how do you do that? Well, there's a mechanical control cable that is connected directly to a potentiometer on top of the engine, which sends a signal to the ECU to tell the ECU what position the throttle is in. So now I'm removing the bracket that holds the actual control cable onto the top of the aftercooler housing. Yeah, it's a pretty neat little option if you're considering a repower but you prefer to keep your original mechanical controls and not add the fly-by-wire system. You know, some people say complexity is the enemy of reliability. So if you're introducing fly-by-wire system, is it less reliable? Some people just prefer the feel of a mechanical control cable. I will tell you that on these Yanmar systems, we've gotten it down to a pretty similar feel when it comes to the resistance and the sensitivity. We can adjust that in the engine ECU mapping with Yanmar Smart Assist tool. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I can start on removing the ECU itself, which is held on by some rubber isolator bushings to minimize the vibration to the ECU itself. There you can see the ECU off the side of the cooler. Now removing the bolts for the bottom bracket and fasteners for the oil lines. And there are 6 bolts that go through the cooler into the cylinder head to seal off the intake. So now with the cooler off, we can see there's oil deposits in the air side of the cooler from the crankcase ventilation system, which can severely affect performance.
That is true, but I'm not used to working in such horrible conditions.
The oil becomes a sticky gunk that can be removed with solvents. So now we're in the shop, and the first thing you're going to want to do is grab a punch or a chisel to mark the end caps in order to reinstall them in the same spot that they came off. I'm a seasoned tech, but I still practice this to soothe my OCD. Once they're marked, you can go ahead and pull the end caps off. Now these engines only have about 150 hours on them, so these coolers came apart really easily. I've been a marine tech for the better part of 25 years, and I've serviced, repaired, or replaced all different types of aftercoolers, shapes, sizes, materials, and I can tell you that the one thing they all have in common is their failure point, which is typically the seal between the air side and the seawater side of the cooler, which is what I'm about to expose here on the cooler in the video. In the case of the cylindrical design aftercooler, where an O-ring is employed as an insulator to seal the air side from the seawater side, the use of a specialized grease around the two bundle ends, end caps, and O-rings can help prevent seawater from entering the air side of the cooler, and possibly extend service intervals. Now I've taken apart so many of these, and I would say about 90% of the coolers that haven't been serviced and greased show some signs of leakage into the air side of the cooler. Conversely, the ones that we have serviced are in pretty good shape when we take them apart and could have probably been left in service for another couple of seasons. A small amount of water entering the air side of the cooler is not catastrophic in nature initially. However, what starts to happen is, as the water evaporates as it meets the hot intake air from the turbo, it leaves just salt. And that salt builds up and starts to make gaps. It starts to expand, very similar to ice. And then you have more and more water flow as the aluminum housing expands, the end caps expands, until eventually the volume of water is enough to hydrolock the engine and possibly bend the connecting rod or rods. And another factor that comes into play here is galvanic corrosion. This cooler is constructed of several different materials, and it is submerged in electrolyte, the salt water. So this process is potentially sped up by galvanic corrosion, and the point of all this is that, in my experience, aftercoolers deserve a lot more attention than they seem to be getting in terms of maintenance. We have an excellent maintenance program here at Cockles Harbor, but I think other facilities need to get on board, because what I see in the field is neglect. It is up to you as a technician or a service provider to inform your customer as to when these types of things need to be taken care of. Alright, back to the service. As I said earlier, these coolers are in pretty good shape, so in this method I just use some brake cleaner and compressed air, but typically if they're in bad shape I use an ultrasonic cleaner. So what you're going to want to do is, over the carbonized areas, just spray some brake cleaner or cleaner degreaser over the fins, and just be careful because they're very delicate. And then once you've done that, blow everything off with compressed air. You'll get the majority of the gunk out of the cooler bundle. And on the seawater side, you can use a welding rod or a suitable sized dowel to run through the cooler bundle and get rid of the debris that's inside there. You can also use some barnacle buster or rid lime to clean that area, and then just wire wheel the top and bottom, and also the sealing surface, which is where the O-ring would land. So just make sure you have all the sealing surfaces clean on both the core and the housing, on the inside diameter housing, the ends of the housing, and also the end caps. And when you have everything all cleaned up, go ahead and inspect those sealing surfaces real closely. You want to make sure there are no cracks, corrosion, pitting of any kind. The whole goal of this is clearly to prevent water from propagating from the seawater side to the air side. So if that O-ring lands on an imperfect surface, this whole practice is pointless. So make sure you inspect all the surfaces good and closely. In this video I use a bead blaster to clean the end caps. You don't have to do that. You can just use a wire wheel or do it by hand, whatever you have, whatever's available to you. It just makes it a lot easier if you do have a bead blast cabinet. Now, as far as the housings are concerned, I didn't show the process of cleaning those, but it's pretty straightforward. The same thing. You can use a wire wheel, piece of fine emery cloth or sandpaper. It depends on the level of corrosion and pitting. Just make sure you inspect that there's no pitting on the housing.
And another thing you want to inspect are the drains. So some of these coolers will have a manual drain, like a petcock. These 4LVs have a automatic drain. So how it works is that it's a spring-loaded check valve, and when there's no pressure, the valve opens, and all the condensation can drain out of the air side of the cooler. So just make sure those are functioning properly. The petcocks I just replace. For the O-ring installation, you want to apply grease to the surface prior to installing the O-ring. And I usually slide it over this way. If you put it on from the other end, you have to stretch out the O-ring, which I don't like to do. So it's better just to slide it down over the end that has the smaller diameter. And then once the O-ring is slid into position, put some more grease on top of the O-ring. Make sure you put plenty of grease on there, and also put some on the inside diameter of the cooler down to like 3 inches or so. Don't be shy with the grease. You want to put plenty of this stuff on there. And next step is to slide the cooler core down into the housing, and you'll have marked the coolers prior to removal, so you'll know exactly how they go back together. And then set the cooler on its side for the installation of the other O-ring. And so for this side, there's no lip, and you're basically putting grease in where the core meets the housing prior to installing the O-ring, and then again after the O-ring is installed. Now, I somehow lost the footage of pressure testing these coolers. I pressure test them before and after assembly. The way it's done before is by sandwiching the cooler core between 2 aluminum plates with rubber affixed to one side, and using threaded rod, squeezing pressure onto the cooler core, and then applying about 25 psi through a regulator and compressed air. Once it's pressurized to about 25 psi, you then shut off the compressed air and monitor the pressure inside the housing. And then just use some soapy water, squirt the entire cooler down, make sure you don't see any air bubbles anywhere, and let it sit for about a half an hour. And then after assembly, the pressure testing process is done by blocking off with some plates again the air side of the cooler, and then pressurizing the seawater side to the same pressure, or vice versa. You can block off the seawater side and pressurize the air side. But either way, you have to make sure that there's no air passing through those O-rings. Okay, once you have the remaining surfaces greased up, go ahead and reinstall the end caps and torque the fasteners to manufacturer's spec, followed by the pencil zincs. And then you're ready to reinstall the coolers. Make sure you use new gaskets and torque all the fasteners to spec. Alright, that's all for this video, and thank you very much for watching.